What really gets me interested with physician practices is the uniqueness with which they have to deal with partner succession planning. So, unlike most businesses, they really have to think about and be thoughtful about how they bring new shareholders into the investments that they have, and conversely, on the other side, how they buy out physicians that are moving into retirement.
Welcome to Medical Money Matters, the podcast where you can find experts, answers, and resources so that you can achieve mastery over the financial and business aspects of your practice. Welcome, everyone. I am joined today by James Winchester, lead financial strategist for CMAC Partners, where he works with medical groups all over the country on a variety of real estate transactions. In previous work lives, he has been an MBA consultant for NASA and a strategy analyst for Siemens. And now he works with physicians who want to own their own real estate, whether it's for an office building or an ambulatory surgery center or a diagnostic imaging center. So James, welcome. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks so much for having me, Jill. Looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. So I'd love to hear what first got you interested in working with medical groups and their real estate?
Well, being from the UK, I didn't know a lot about the US medical system until really I started at CMAC Partners. And what really gets me interested with physician practices is the uniqueness with which they have to deal with partner succession planning. So unlike most businesses, they really have to think about and be thoughtful about how they bring new shareholders into the investments that they have, and conversely, on the other side, how they buy out physicians that are moving into retirement. So that really encompasses a lot of my day to day, is thinking about strategies that help physician practices do that on the real estate side, as well as some financing for their real estate acquisitions and the buildings that they own.
That is wonderful. And I'm so glad you opened with this notion of the US healthcare system. I've referred to it many times as it's pretty wackadoodle. And that's a technical term, but as compared to what you're used to in the UK, it's a very, very different animal. So, at any rate,
Yep.
well, I'm glad that you're working with physicians, and there are very complex transactions they have to navigate. To your point, the succession planning is a big piece. So talk a little more in detail about what you do. Sort of what kind of deals are you doing, and what kind of groups are you most frequently working with?
So it's almost exclusively independent practices, predominantly practices where there are multiple physicians.
Mhm.
It's all different kinds of specialties, but generally, we have more clients that are in the orthopedic realm or the GI realm, producers, that are very independent in nature,
Mhm.
and are very business oriented, and are looking for ancillary streams of revenue to kind of increase their share of the medical dollar. And that tends to be a little bit more dominated by your orthopods and some of the higher earning specialists.
Yeah, and those that do cases in centers rather than the hospitals. So that's or where they
Correct.
can do both. But frequently, what I hear from physicians is they have a difficult time getting block time at the hospital, and so their surgical days are much more efficient when they can be in an ambulatory surgery center, especially one that they own. That really aligns everything. So
Yeah.
yeah. So well, I always like to ask a question like this, but tell us about the craziest story that you had in a real estate deal?
The craziest story is probably it's actually a story that we see happen quite a lot, to be honest with you, and that is where a group goes out and enters into a real estate investment, and the partners at that time, all decide to contribute their capital, and they enter into an investment that doesn't have necessarily the foresight of what's going to change within the practice over the years. Real estate is a long-term investment. And the makeup of the practice is not going to be the same in 5, 10, 15 years' time as it is at the inception of that real estate investment.
Yeah.
What happens and what makes that crazy is you end up with partners that have moved into retirement that still have a say in the investment decisions on the
Mm.
real estate side. And that can cause some real problems, particularly when groups are looking to grow and expand and use some of the value that they've built up in the real estate already. So we've seen many instances where that has actually hindered future growth because the ongoing physicians that are part of the practice aren't able to use the equity that they've built in pre-existing real estate investments because it no longer suits the objectives of the retired physicians.
Got it. Got it. That I imagine could create a lot of imbalance and probably some high emotion as well if you have people in different stages and if they're in conflict. So that's wonderful. I want to come back to that idea a little bit later. Um, on your CMAC website, as part of your bio, it says your favorite movie is 12 Angry Men. So I want to hear a little bit about why that's your fave.
Well, firstly, probably not my favorite movie, but we had to put a movie that was black and white. So
Oh,
being a
okay.
being a millennial, obviously this was not a task created by a millennial. Our managing partner decided that it would be a good idea to use this as a way to kind of spruce up our bios on our website.
Ah,
Um,
okay. Expand your horizons a little bit too, probably, huh?
Correct. And actually, going through my MBA program, 12 Angry Men was one of the assignments that we had. And I thought it was actually pretty interesting in terms of, I think the takeaway was uh, how groupthink can sometimes creep in
Mhm.
if you have, a number of individuals that are going in one direction, and how do you counteract that? So if you have seen 12 Angry Men and looking for an hour and a half MBA, it's a good way to get some um, good content out there as to how you can deal with those kind of situations.
There you go, and probably has some applicability as we were talking earlier when groups may or may not be in agreement on what to do. So, perfect. I love it. Well,
It, it kind of takes me to the Ted Lasso quote as well: "Be curious, not judgmental," um, because that movie kind of personifies that to a certain extent, where everyone's judging the individual that wants to head in one direction, whereas the 11 others want to go in another.
mhm, mhm, I love it. Okay, and I don't think we've had a Ted Lasso quote on this podcast yet, so you win the prize for that one.
E- Excellent.
Ah, I love it. Well, take 2 steps back and talk a little bit about, practice owners. We have many in our audience, who may be renting space and want to look at purchasing their own building, and where would you say is a good place for them to begin?
Well, I think part of the challenge that groups are facing right now with ownership is construction costs have risen. Interest rates are higher than they have been.
Mhm,
So, I think to start off with, there needs to be some thoughtful analysis that's done so that the group can understand what does an ownership opportunity look like. I think a lot of physicians that we deal with have the understanding that real estate is a good long-term investment, but they don't really know why or what that investment looks like. I think that when you dig into the numbers and try and understand, well, yeah, your lease rate is likely to increase relative to space that you're currently renting. Does that make it a bad investment? And I think you have to look at the other side as to, well, what kind of return am I receiving for that additional lease expense?
mhm,
Because that return, comes not only typically on the revenues that are generated from the practice and the ancillaries, like, an ambulatory surgery center or imaging space or PT space, that are maybe not being captured in the existing space. But they also come from the fact that you have a real estate investment where you're receiving some portion of your rent back in real estate distributions and you're building equity over time. That can be a great growth tool for additional pieces of real estate. So back to your original question, what advice would I provide? It really comes down to digging into that analysis on both the real estate side and on the practice side to try and look at whether this is a good investment rather than just an increase in our expense.
Got it. Got it. Well, it brings me to this the old adage of the best time to buy real estate is any time before today. And but your point is well made. Like the construction costs are up and interest rates are up, and so could you envision a scenario where it's better for physicians to continue renting a few more years, maybe to see if the construction costs come down or if interest rates come down, or do you think it's always kind of a keep your foot on the gas, keep headed for that purchase if that's where you're going?
I think that it depends. I think for most private practices, they have different kinds of locations. They have kind of oftentimes have a core market that they work in, and then they may have some peripheral markets. And the decision of whether to own or lease, I think, should be dictated more by, do we have a continued belief that we're going to be in the market that we're in? So generally a core market, I
Got it.
think, is a better ownership opportunity than a peripheral market. Certainly from a construction cost standpoint, I think the cat's out of the bag a little bit in that regard. And, while we've seen a slight decrease in construction costs, I don't think it has been meaningful.
Mm,
And, from the folks that we speak in the construction industry, it's not like there's going to be a precipitous drop. From an interest rate standpoint, what we get involved with most of the time on a day-to-day basis with clients, I think firstly, they're oftentimes surprised with how attractive interest rates actually are right now for groups,
mhm.
for independent practices that are strong. For example, we're seeing 10-year loans that are sub 5% interest
Wow.
rates,
Yeah.
whereas I think the expectation for most practices that haven't gone through that analysis is they're going to be looking at 6 or 7% interest rates like the residential markets.
Yeah.
So, we speak to a lot of clients that have been in and around real estate ownership for 20 or 30 years, and they look at a number that starts with a 4 as being almost free money. We're back to the good old days. So, we've obviously been in an environment over the last 4 or 5 years where interest rates have been near zero. So it's just changing that perspective a little bit. So that would be my first comment. Secondly, there are a lot of structures out there that allow for groups from an interest rate standpoint to have some fixed rate security, but have some upside in the scenario rates do decline in the future. So
Yeah.
you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, in that regard. All of these things I think come together to turn around and say your kind of adage at the beginning of this, the best time to invest in real estate, is today, if you haven't already done so, generally speaking.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Can you talk a little bit more about the construct of that have your cake and eat it too scenario? I'm guessing everybody would want to hear more about that. How does that work?
Yeah, so banks, will provide oftentimes different options as it relates to the long-term fixed rate that you're entering into. And so most groups, they want to know that if we get into a construction project or we go and acquire a building, that we have security moving forwards, that our interest rate isn't going to increase. They want to know that they have, a fixed payment. So you're able to receive that with banks in a couple of different ways. Typically, you can either have a bank, what we call internally fix the interest rate, and they hold it on their own balance sheet. In
Okay.
that particular case, it becomes really important that you negotiate the prepayment penalty that is a part of that loan.
Yeah.
Because if you're going out and getting a 10-year loan, you can oftentimes have no prepayment penalty, or you can have a prepayment penalty that burns off, say in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
In that particular case, right, you've locked in based off of today's rates. But if we see a reduction in interest rates, then you can capitalize on that reduction pretty quickly
Yeah.
and see a much better improvement in your return, the kind of return that you'll end up receiving, in a couple of years if you were waiting, but you've missed out on the opportunity perhaps to lock in at today's construction costs.
Got it.
The kind of second option is what we call interest rate swaps. And I won't go into too much detail with regards to those because I could probably be here all day talking about the different options that are
Yeah.
available with interest rate swaps. But they're another method of fixing your interest rate. that can allow you to, say, fix a portion of the debt and leave a portion variable. So, if you were looking at, say, a $10 million loan, you might decide that you want fixed interest rates for $5 million worth of that loan, but you want to leave $5 million variable such that when interest rates decline based off of the Fed's actions, actually, the Fed's got a meeting in 7 days. So
Yeah.
we're patiently waiting to see how much they decide to cut interest rates. Well,
Yeah.
you can be the beneficiary of that cut as part of the floating portion of your loan. So, all of that, summarizing all of that, is there's options out there oftentimes for you to, as I said, have your cake and eat it too.
Got it. Okay. I like that. Sign me up for the have your cake and eat it too. I like that. I like that. And so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the major pitfalls of real estate investing. We touched on one earlier, and we'll come back to sort of alignment in agreements. But what else? What else should physicians be wary of?
So from our perspective, obviously there's a number of things with real estate that you have to consider, but from our perspective, in particular, we see a big difference between a group doing what we describe as an owner occupied
Mhm.
real estate investment, where they are buying the real estate that practice or their ancillaries are occupying,
Mhm.
and a third party, speculative real estate investment. We would argue that there's a big difference in risk. Actually, when the banks are offering loan terms, they look at it as a completely different investment
Mm.
opportunity on their side. So
Yeah.
they'll provide much better rates and terms for an owner occupied real estate investment than they do for an investment property.
Got it.
And what it really comes down to is, if you can create alignment between your real estate company and your practice entity, then you really remove a lot of the traditional real estate risks. As a real estate owner, one of my risks is, are my tenants going to continue to make their lease payments? Are they going to continue to uphold the building in a manner that I see as, the way that I would want my building to be upheld? Am I going to have to worry about my tenant renewing their lease at the end of its term? All of these real estate risks, I think, are muted in the scenario you have an aligned investment between the practice and the real estate entity. And because of that, we look at these owner occupied real estate investments as more like practice investments in the real estate. But I know you probably, going to have a question, because we talk about it a lot, about, well, how do you create that alignment of
Yes.
thought process with the practice and the real estate investment, which I think is something a lot of groups struggle with.
Yeah. Well, let's keep running down that path. Thank you for that. Because you and I have talked about that a lot, and that is that need, and you brought it up earlier, to have the practices operating agreement mirror the building owner's operating agreements, so that the triggering events in one trigger events in another, so we don't get into that scenario you described earlier of the retired partners kind of having a very different view of the world. So, could you talk a little bit about the importance of having those two aligned?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head in terms of, well, what does it all go back to? And typically, it will go back to the operating agreements and the relationship between the practice operating agreement and the real estate operating agreement. I think most groups, when they first think about real estate ownership, they look at it as a completely separate investment, because they're advised by their legal counsel that it should be put into a separate entity, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a separate real estate entity. Does it have a strong relationship with the practice? And I think that that is a difficult hurdle to get over initially. The next kind of mistake that we often see made is then just asking your counsel for a real estate operating agreement without building a strong connection between what the practice is trying to achieve and what the real estate is trying to achieve.
Mhm.
And a lot of the times these are really good operating agreements, but they are more for in real estate investors where there isn't that owner occupied relationship. The
Got it.
benefits that I think most groups are trying to receive via having alignment between their real estate operating agreement and their practice operating agreement are all of those benefits that I just mentioned in the last discussion. They want to know that at the end of the lease term that they have a tenant that continues to have an interest in occupying the building that they own.
Yes.
The challenge that very often emerges is if you don't have a structure that continues to align the ownership over time with the practice, then there becomes questions from partners as to, well, should we continue to lease this building? Particularly if the new partners that have joined the practice in the time since that real estate investment has occurred start asking the question of, well, why should I continue to lease this space when I never received the opportunity to invest in the upside of the real estate? It becomes a divisive topic.
Yeah.
And it creates some really difficult questions. You then have the other side of it where partners in retirement have been promised something, they've invested their capital, and that promise results in the kind of friction that I just mentioned. So we are very hot on the topic of how do we create alignment
Yeah.
that that unravels a whole host of other questions as to, well, how can that alignment be an attractive proposition for all of the partners, which is
Yep.
these are more difficult questions to answer. Um, but that's what I think I really enjoy about my day to day is we get to answer a lot of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we've worked with groups, you and I, with some shared clients that are, have a fairly mature ownership in the building, and then need to sort of recalibrate, if you will, the equity in there for the retiring partners, and the equity on on the buy-in side for the newly incoming partners. And I see a lot of groups that have it, they're the physicians are not real estate professionals, so they're not thinking about these things the way you might. And so I see a lot of groups that feel sort of hamstrung by their real estate when in fact they have a lot of options. So yeah, what would you say about options for groups, like if they're sort of midlife with a piece of real estate? What do you see happening?
So, so we hear so often um, that the younger physicians that are coming in, they don't have the same risk tolerance as us, and they don't have the same interest in investing in uh, these kind of investments like the real estate. And I think a lot of the time, not all of the time, but a lot of the time when we dig into that particular problem, the group has not recognized that the investment opportunity has changed from what was available at inception. In fact, the nature of having an ongoing, evolving real estate investment where you're trying to bring new partners in and you're trying to buy partners out at retirement results in a number of individual investments rather than just an entity having an investment.
Mm,
And if I'm a partner that buys in year two, I have a different proposition to a partner that buys in year five,
yeah.
and so on and so forth. And I think you need a structure that recognizes that. The best way that we can oftentimes highlight that to practices is by asking you mentioned a mature real estate investment, asking the physician group, well, if you didn't own the real estate that you own today, what would you do? Most of the time, they've paid down their debt
Mhm.
to a low position, a low what we call LTV, loan to value.
Yep.
They've built up a lot of equity. And our question is, well, if you didn't own the building, would you go and put the same amount of capital that you have in it now and the same amount of debt that you have in it now, and therefore actually reduce your returns because you have a less leveraged return and
Yeah.
increase your exposure because you're putting more money in?
Yep.
And most of the time we frame it in that way. The physician groups that we deal with turn around and say, well, there's absolutely no way I put all of that
Right.
money in again. And again, we do what we did at inception, obviously.
Yeah.
However, what's the new partner that's trying to buy into the real estate being afforded? They're being afforded the complete opposite of what the initial partners would do.
Right.
So there's a balancing act there and a discussion to be had with most groups as to how can we create something that's affordable and attractive and somewhat fair and equitable for our partners over the lifetime of our partnership?
Yeah, well, that's fantastic and very clearly laid out. Thank you. That articulates the issue really beautifully. And your point is well made. No group would go out and put 50 or 60% down to buy a building, as if that's their equity position. Yeah, good time to look at it and reevaluate it. What are the sort of common structures that you see in terms of loan to value on a new acquisition?
Most groups that we deal with that are looking at real estate ownership for the first time in particular want to put as little money down as possible.
Yeah.
We have actually some groups in the Oregon market that are really fortunate where they've been able to enter into structures where they've had to put nothing down. And
Wow.
actually and that oftentimes is a result of also using the practice's financial borrowing ability in conjunction with the real estate entity.
Yeah.
Usually most banks, if you were exclusively looking at a real estate loan, are comfortable going up to 80 or maybe 85% loan to value,
Hmm.
meaning in a best case scenario, you'd have a 15% down payment.
Yeah.
Well, certainly if one of your key objectives at inception is equal ownership between each and every partner, the easiest way to do that is to not require any partners to put anything in. Because as soon as you start having to require partners to put 50, 100, 250,000 in, the reality is some partners are going to be able to do that and other partners aren't.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so you end up opening up the unequal ownership can create difficulties for any one subset.
Yeah, yeah, that's very well put. I've seen those where we have unequal ownership shares, and then yeah, again, whole nother dynamic for all of the owners and the leadership of the group to try to manage. So, how about the most complicated real estate scenario you've seen?
I think for us the most challenging usually occurs when a group has had real estate ownership for some period of time and they've decided to treat the investments as separate and distinct, and they've kind of grown in different disparate directions.
Mm,
We actually had a client that we dealt with about a year ago that was the result of a merger between 5 different practices. They're an orthopedic group.
okay.
4 of those practices owned their medical real estate, and each of them had a slightly different structure, but most of them had unequal ownership with some, retired physician ownership. And
Okay.
what happened at the first board meeting as a group when they came together, they turned around and said, "Well, our real estate's pretty inefficient. We need to come together and build, a main location, and we need to consolidate a couple of locations." And each of the groups looked at each other and said, "Well, you're not closing my building because the value of their buildings is derived from the lease income
Yeah,
that the building has." So we ended up being brought in a strategic decision on the practice level without disproportionately impacting any of the individual owners.
got it.
Um, So back to what we've been harping on about for a lot of this discussion, without alignment between the real estate investments and the practice, you really make it difficult for your senior leadership to make any kind of decisions that could be beneficial for both sides. Um, and once the proverbial can is out of the worm is out of the can, sorry, it could be a challenge, making those kind of decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is interesting when you start to unravel it all, especially where you have multiple groups with multiple centers coming together and yeah, how to get alignment. One of the things we talk about often on the podcast is that our medical education system does not give physicians here in the US does not give physicians any finance or business training as they're going through their learning program. It is all clinical focused, and we absolutely want them to have the clinical focus. And I think that'll be one of my hobbies when I retire, is to see if we can get a little more business and finance sort of into the medical school curriculum. Well, that one sounds fascinating, complicated and fascinating. How about, would you share with us your very best outcome with a group and their real estate?
I certainly can. I want to just touch upon something that you just said, and I think in speaking with you, Jill, that's one of the reasons why we both find dealing with medical professionals so enjoyable, because they're obviously very smart. They've with trusted advisors, because they become skeptical
Yeah,
because of the fact that this isn't their main profession, shall we say, or their main area of expertise. So
right.
when you are able to kind of show them the light and go through that process and earn your position as a trusted advisor, I think it makes it a very enjoyable position to be in, a very fulfilling position to be in.
Yeah.
So I think, like you, that's one of the reasons that I really enjoy working in this particular industry.
Well, and
But
one of the reasons why we tell our clients, call CMAC, when you have real estate questions. So thank you for calling that out. It is an honor and a privilege, really, to get to walk with physicians and the to help them, first with their understanding of these more complex business transactions, and then yeah, secondly, to see the practices really thrive. I know you get a lot of professional satisfaction, as I do, out of seeing physicians really have thriving businesses. So
absolutely,
that's
and back to your question. Um, so we have one thing that I haven't really spoken about much in the discussion so far is actually the main area of business that CMAC works in, which is helping groups to finance their medical real estate, and it's really what we've done since our inception. Um, we are consistently out in the market, placing financing for groups. But you mentioned the best outcome that we've seen, and it was actually, a combination of some really good pricing from the bank and some really good timing as it relates to the market. But we have a loan that we put in place that we refer to as the GOAT loan, the greatest of all time, which was actually an orthopedic group that were able to get 10-year financing with no personal guarantees at 1.68%.
how.
And they actually came to us afterwards a little confused, thinking, well, is that the spread, that the bank was taking on the
Legit
loan? And we were
question.
like, no, that's your interest
That's
rate.
the actual rate. Wow. Yeah. Well, after everybody's listening to this, they're going to be getting in touch with you to see about getting one of those loans. That's I love it. That's a fantastic outcome. Wow. Yeah, and a little bit of free money there. There we go. Well, let's wind up the conversation today with your best advice for groups that are contemplating a real estate play.
Well, it's actually where I'm going to be seeing you later this week at the Congress of Physician-Owned Medical Properties (CPOMP) conference. I've had the good fortune of going to the last 5 or 6 annual meetings.
Mm-hmm.
It's where we learn a lot of the issues that groups are encountering with their real estate.
Yeah.
It's where countless groups have been able to understand how and why they should own their real estate and in what kind of structures. So, in my opinion, it's all well and good going to your trusted advisors, but you also need to hear from your peers about the things that have worked and haven't worked. And the CPOP meetings, there isn't a better place, in my opinion, to be able to go and get that insight. So, we're really excited that this is going to be happening just later on this week.
Wonderful. Well, and that's at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs. You can find it online, CPOP 2024. And I heard a rumor that it's also going to be at the Broadmoor next year as well. So fabulous location. And James, I just want to thank you for all of the time this morning for sharing your expertise. And everyone will put James's contact information into the show notes. But he's available via LinkedIn and also online at cmacpartners.com. It's spelled CMAC Partners. And again, we'll put those links in the notes. And James, thank you so much for everything today.
Thank you for having me, Jill. Really enjoyable and always good seeing you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Bye.
You can find more information online at medicalmoneymatterspodcast.com, and you can sign up to be notified when enrollment opens for the Medical Money Matters e-learning program for a mini MBA, physician style, which will carry CME credits and will be released in upcoming months. In that, we'll do an even deeper dive so you can understand dynamic budgeting strategies, cash flow forecasting, and other more esoteric financial concepts. We've included those links in the show notes. As I like to close out these podcasts, congratulations on taking the next step in your professional development and for making the commitment to learn about the financial and business aspects of your practice. I look forward to being on this journey with you and send you my heartfelt gratitude for all that you do for your patients all day, every day.